gals and pals, this is everyone's second favourite podcast host. That's right, this is me, Erin, here with a little bit of information on how today's It's Not Always Dark podcast was recorded. First things first, there's a pandemic, a global pandemic in fact. So Kieran and myself have recorded this remotely in accordance with government guidelines, meaning there's going to be a little bit of latency in the audio and our responses and our interactions. Promise we're not normally this awkward, it's just the way things are now. There's even some fireworks in the background of this one because we decided it was going to be a good idea to record on bonfire night. So smart. Secondly, this is going to be the first in a series that we're doing here on the It's Not Always Dark podcast about art, creativity and philosophy, where we're going to be answering some pretty big questions, or at least trying to. It's pretty serious stuff. Any articles or videos or anything that we refer to throughout this, I have included in the podcast notes at the bottom of the description. You're so welcome, everyone. Please go have a look, check stuff out, get involved, have a read, have a listen, and please keep listening to the It's Not Always Dark podcast. I hope to see you very, very soon. Enjoy!
Hello and welcome to the It's Not Always Dark podcast. We're your hosts, Kieran
and Erin.
And today's topic is separating art from the artist. Is it essential or reckless? Today we're going to be discussing two papers for and against art separation, and in light of many vocal opinions recently from J.K. Rowling, we'll be focusing in on her and her transphobia before sharing our own feelings regarding this larger topic as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
Shall we dive in?
Shall we? I think before we get into these articles, the whole thing of like, should you separate art from the artist is sort of like, it's one of those big questions that there's never really going to be an answer to. But what are your current thoughts and feelings going into this situation?
Oh, okay. So my current thoughts are that I found the whole topic of separating art from the artist to be difficult, very layered, and often circumstantial.
Yeah.
There are a lot of things that go into why people want an artist to no longer have like the acclaim, you know? And many times there's really valid reasons behind it. I think it's a lot of the time people's behavior as, you know, as an artist, like just who they are as a person often brings them into the forefront of discussion. And then that in turn becomes, okay, do we want to support this person and what they've created? For example, in my head, someone who comes to mind is Doja Cat.
Yeah.
So I like Doja Cat and I have liked a lot of her songs, especially when she came out with like the Hot Pink album. But in recent events, like there's been a lot of discussion online about whether we should be supporting her because there was a lot of like internalized racism that seemed to be going on, and she was in like chat rooms with like these incels, like just a bunch of men who were like all white for the most part.
I had no
and
idea.
It seemed as though she was like she had like a song as well that it was essentially toward like the black man's detriment. So ultimately it is difficult because you hear a lot of these things, but I still hear Say So Come On, and I'm like grooving my head without even realizing it.
So the entire TikTok community, I think, are with you on that one.
Oh, 100%.
See, I'm not very familiar with Doja Cat, so I didn't know of that, but I totally get that feeling of like, oh, this is something I enjoyed, and now I feel a bit icky about it.
Yeah,
and
a lot of ickiness these days.
Yeah, no, I get that. And I think there is the whole thing of, it seems almost easier in my head to detach the art from the artist once the artist is dead. Like,
oh yeah, I get that.
But I think my main reasoning for that is that if the person is still alive and is still continuing to make art, like they have the potential for their opinions and behaviors to be changed.
Yeah.
It's sort of a bit late when someone has passed.
Yeah, ultimately one of the things that I would say toward that is that people are very much, especially in this day and age, no one wants to accept that we make mistakes as people and that we have a chance to grow, because no one wants the opportunity to let someone grow, especially if you're famous. No one will let that down. Like, you will always have one person that, like, under like your Instagram comments, like Twitter comments, they're all going to have someone pointing out what you did 5 years ago and said to that day.
And the thing is, that's not even like just if you're famous. Like I think like now I'm like, oh, there's people in my life that I'm like, oh, if I do this, like, are they gonna judge me hard for that? If I upgrade my opinion because I've become more knowledgeable, is someone from when I was back in school gonna be like, oh, well, you said this that one time?
Yeah. It's so true though, because it's a big concern. I do often think the same things myself. Like, if I were to suddenly appear doing one thing or another, is someone going to try and come after me, you know?
Yeah.
Because people don't like to see others move on. I think that's where the problem comes, is that some people are so attached to that moment in time, and you in that moment, that you still appear vividly to them as though you were still there.
As that person, yeah.
Yeah, like you're still that person. So as soon as you start to like change it up and switch up the game, they don't want you to switch up the game because they like the game as it was. And that's where I think the problem comes in.
Yeah, but then I think we have like the situation of like most, I think, good people will try and make the decisions to say and act and learn in ways that are to them progressing them. And
yes.
Like, so people are probably trying to learn and do good. It just, I think, especially when you're looking at certain situations, people's version of good in quotation marks is a bit skewed.
Very skewed, like to the point where you'd even question whether they're actually trying to be good about it.
100%. And then there are other people that are just out to be controversial for the sake of it, that don't really have a moral compass for whatever reason, you know.
It's a little messy, and especially like in regard to art versus the artist. Like, I feel as though I stand in the position, like I was saying, where it's circumstantial, but very often I try my best to look at how the art has been created. So in that way, I mean, I find it difficult with music because a lot of the time the person who like is in quotation marks the problem, they are the one that is singing on the album. Like, it is them directly, and it's part of them, it's part of the core.
Yeah.
So I can't often think about all the other people that worked on the album because they're doing the instruments, they're doing like the layering, they're doing like all the production side of things.
Yeah.
When it comes to like a film though, I think you have this interesting point where if you've created something like as a novel and it's been adapted, or even you've just made the script for it and you're considered controversial, but then actors then take on the roles that you've created.
Yeah.
And I think it becomes kind of a life of its own, because it's no longer like, oh, I don't like you because you made this story. You kind of, if you like the way that film went together, you think about those actors and how they portrayed the character, and a lot of the time they seem to take the film elsewhere, which is what I think the case is with soon to be mentioned J.K. Rowling. You know, I think that the actors that she gets for these roles, they ultimately end up not only speaking out against her, but they end up being so good in the role that you think about them before you even think about JK.
Yeah.
Which is that them that's doing the right part? Like, is it her that's written the character so well? Like, I'm gonna say it's the actor, but you know, it does pose the question, like, when it comes to separation, at what point do we just say, I hear you, but I'm not liking it because of that, I'm liking it because of this?
Yeah, I think it's funny that you said that, because I've literally got written down here, like, I'm a person who loves the behind the scenes of things, and
totally,
that's, I think, part of, I feel like I should disclose, like, I'm a bit of a Harry Potter enthusiast. Like, I'm very into like all the folklore, like all the
Potterhead.
And the thing is like, it's not even an interest really in the books or like the J.K. Rowling material anymore. It's like all the conspiracy theories and all the people who have made their own creations based on that. Like, I love like all the like YouTube channels where they're talking about like, what does this mean, and like breaking down the trailers, like, oh, what's gonna happen in Crimes of Grindelwald.
So fun.
Like, that's like, I love that stuff.
Totally, I'm with you on that. fandom culture in and of itself is exciting because it's people who felt that same sort of spark from what you watched that have come together to create more content that you enjoy without having to like necessarily be canon 100% correct. They're just speculating because it's fun to like something with other people.
Yeah, but so like my whole thing of like my enjoyment of Harry Potter, I think now has little to nothing to do with J.K. Rowling. But at the end of the day, she will always be the person that made and created these characters. So like finding that disassociation between her and the material is something that I think I'm still in this weird state of limbo, and that's sort of like where I sit with this whole argument, which is a bit annoying. Like I feel sort of like devil's advocate with the situation, because after reading these articles, like there are valid points on both sides. I do completely get it.
Yeah,
and then
I agree.
I notice, and this is like a very, I guess, not awesome thing to do, but I do sort of switch how I want to argue my thoughts and feelings based on how I want it to go. Like what more do I want to defend this material, or do I not want to defend it? And I'm like, that makes me a flawed person, but we all are, I guess.
No, we're all flawed. We're all imperfectly perfect. So I don't think there's any point trying to argue to ourselves like what it is that we do. Sometimes I think people have a hard time holding themselves accountable. And it's like a pattern where you're able to be like, oh, but I'm for separation, or I'm against it. But then you do have moments where you'll do it yourself and not say to yourself you've done it. You'll just let it pass. I think I'm very much the same in that, like I mentioned Doja Cat, I still, like, there's songs of hers I'll still listen to. And it's because that moment when I heard those songs brought me so much happiness that I'm just trying to think of that moment and how good I felt with the song then. And it's difficult because, like, for one, who are we as people to tell another person, like, who hasn't been like legally convicted or proven to have done anything wrong, like, unless there's like a stone hard like truth by whoever, you know, who are we to decide like you're not getting support by anyone anymore, you don't deserve it? Because fuck, well, no one's supporting us. Is that why we're so quick to try and take support from others, because we don't have the same support?
That's true. I think it is a bit like, I don't know.
It's awkward, and it's a big topic, and that's why arguments for and against are really helpful, because these are people that were able to figure out where they stood on it, and that's why it's always nice to have that.
Yeah, and like these articles are very strongly either way. We're not necessarily saying that we firmly agree on either side, that we condone disregarding people being hateful, because this whole separating the art from the artist thing stems from artists and people in general have the potential to be shitty, and
they will
do say and act in horrible ways. And this I feel like I just want to clarify that this isn't us trying to justify or condone any of these behaviours. This is just us opening up a discussion that can't necessarily be closed. We can have a look at... Should be continued and should be discussed, especially when there's so many people having really big, loud opinions in our world right now. We might not necessarily agree with them all or believe them to be good.
I think, like, just before we actually go into these articles, the one thing that I would like to say is that we are just two individuals, much like anyone who may come across this podcast. We are sharing our opinions because at the end of the day, this is like a discussion between us. So we're not always going to be 100% correct about what we're saying. We're just sharing our thoughts and feelings, because I think at the end of the day, all that you can do is try and put out like the energy that you want to in the world. Try and be positive if that's for you. You know, some people don't want to be, but I think that we as people, we try and put out the good, and we're never trying to bring the bad. That's all I'd say about that. So our first author is a man named Ed Siegel, not like the bird, Siegel. See
Sigil.
gel. Like you're doing your hair.
And these are both articles from a website, wbur.org/the artery. And like the artery as in the ART bit is capitalized, which I think is a wonderful little pun there. There needs to be more puns like that in the world.
I love a pun. Puns make everything lighter by just association.
Yeah.
So I would say that generally I found like his introduction was distasteful. I thought it was what a way to try and get your point across.
Yeah. So this man, Mr. Ed, and this article was released in March last year, 2019.
Yeah.
I think it's important when reading things to try and look at a bit of the context that it was written in. I just read this man's bio on the website and I was like, you strike me possibly like you use the word snowflake.
Yeah.
To
Very
describe
that energy.
people of our age.
Yeah.
But, we'll move on from that. So that was just like, I felt like I needed to be aware of that when I went into reading the article, which he opens on a very sarcastic statement. Basically saying that because there was like speculation about Isaac Newton, he was choosing to no longer believe in gravity. And his main point throughout this article is that if you don't separate science from the scientist, why would you separate art from the artist?
Which, to some extent, is not 100% wrong in thinking so. Like,
No, I think that's...
I also just think it's too broad of a way to look at it. You can't just... People are not wanting to deal with, like, issues and, like, what comes up in an individual issue. Like, they try to take every situation and apply, like, one way for it because that would just be more convenient,
Yeah. I think
that's the case with this man.
And I would like to think that he's probably a more complex character than that. And this is him just like, he's really tried to boil it down into the simplest argument that he could make. And I don't see that there's any like non-fact in his idea that, we don't separate science from the scientist. And
no.
I mean, I think he goes in a bit hard on the
he does
comparing art to science, and he is big on the art's what separates humans from animals. And
which, on that topic of the animals, I'm just wanting to put this out there because I went and did a little research to make sure I wasn't wrong in thinking so. There are animals that partake in art creation and have done for a long time.
Who are they? Oh my god.
So according to this BBC article that I read, these birds called bowerbirds, they basically, like, as they're creating a nest to try and get, like, a mate, they decorate outside the nest with one single colour. Like, it'll be like a really royal blue. And they'll find all these little items and they'll just create this massive, like, really artistic looking nest assortment to try and get someone to mate with them. So they are like the artists of the bird world. And then on top of that, in 1957, like London Zoo had Congo the chimpanzee who would often draw for them. And he ended up having like an exhibit at the Institute of Contemporary Arts as well. So I'm just putting that one out there that although, yes, statistically, humans can take part in art far more easily than animals, there have been some. I'm going to put some respect on their name right now. Give them the shout out. One of the phrases that I thought was really good and why I kind of agreed with him for this part was that Ed Siegel said that artists, like scientists, deal with truths and then ... and are as indispensable as scientists in leading forward a higher understanding of what it is to be human. Which I agree. It's just a different type of understanding that I think he's being selective in how he presents it. As later when we go into Maria's argument, the second author who is specifically responding to this man, she puts the point home of like medicine helps humans. Art is like another type of help. Like we can't directly compare science and art because the two, like they both provide different things, but realistically science can really do more than art and art can do more than science. It's just...
Yeah. I think throughout this article, there are... How do I say this? I don't disagree with the whole underlying premise of it all, right? I do get the whole art artist, science scientist. That is a very valid point in my opinion. It made me sort of go, oh, but he mentions like Louis C.K. and stuff near the end.
Yes.
And then talks about people bottlenecking platforms and distribution of art. And then goes to compare that to book burning.
Yeah.
Which is not only
same.
like kind of insensitive, but I think that's a very intense way of, and that moves the discussion into censorship, and that's a big old topic in itself. But
far too big to get into fully.
You know, in a world with social media, anyone can distribute anything. There's a website for everything, I'm sure. So no one's saying that you can't distribute your art even if it's controversial. Whether people choose to go and have a look at it and boycott it and show it in their theatres or have that book in their shop, that's, up to the business or the person at hand.
Totally.
And to think, I don't know, it just really bothered me that he compared it to book burning. I thought that's not the one for me.
I didn't even like fully pick out on the book burning part as like something that I'd like had noticed, but hearing it like the way you're explaining it to me there, like this is one of these situations where whenever Erin and I have conversations, she'll come out with something and she'll say it from her perspective and it will completely like rock my world a little bit and I'll go, oh shit, like I didn't even think about that. So thank you for that. Yeah, I agree with you though. Like it's this whole thing to me, it feels as though the way that this man likes to write is that he likes to make really big and bold statements and or comparisons in hopes that by creating such like vivid images in your head, he can convince you of his argument more strongly than someone who possibly like uses more flowery language, when you're trying to make a cake. So
he has done a very good job at being a journalist here.
Oh yeah, of course.
It's a very, like, for what it is, he's got like that bold opening statement. He's continued the argument the whole way through. Like, it's not that I'm finding great flaw with. He knows what his opinion is. He's stuck to his guns. Right, we'll give him that.
I'll give him that. We'll give him that.
But it does seem to come across that he believes that anyone who doesn't share that opinion with him is like of lesser intelligence.
Yeah.
There's a situation with a director, I think it was Polanski.
Roman Polanski, yeah.
The Academy that do the Oscars. They didn't separate the art from the artist, and he gives off the impression that he believes that had they chosen not to award him, that they would have been of lesser intelligence. And that's like, do what you want, but I wouldn't, stick to your own opinion as hard as you would think that someone is less intelligent or nonsensical for
having the opinion. For me, I would say that goes kind of hand in hand with the point that I have, that when he's saying to people, if you boycott certain like types of artists for what they've done, he said that you're implicitly saying art is a lesser pursuit than science, which that's not how this works. Like, I think his thing is that he really does like to compare art and science, and because of that, anything that he says, he starts to believe in a way of, like, if we don't support, like, you were just talking about Roman Polanski there, and you were saying if the Academy weren't to have supported them, he was going to think that they were of a lesser intelligence. That's almost directly what he's saying, because he's trying to look at it from, like, a scientific standpoint, where you can have someone with lesser intelligence there. Art, it's having intelligence involved, but you don't have to be a really smart person to create art that people can, like, that speaks for people. Yeah, I agree with what you're saying, and I think that he just... I think he looks at it from a perspective that I can't say is wrong, but it's definitely not how I look at things.
Yeah, that's like, I think my overall takeaway from reading that article was like, I don't disagree with it, but I think this is a very extreme and almost like exclusive way of viewing things, and I maybe wouldn't have worded things quite that way.
I agree. I think it's just strange to him that by holding more accountability over the artists that we like consume content from, he like seems to think that we'll have like a weaker moral universe as a whole because of it.
Yeah.
I think if anything, it creates a stronger moral universe to be holding artists accountable because you're wanting to keep the morals that we have today relevant through the art that we're consuming, so that ultimately down the line, someone's going to look at the art that's been created and they're going to be able to look at the point in time and they're going to be able to see a lot of different things going on in there. But they're going to see that that person at the end of the day wasn't a complete shite bag.
Yeah, context is important.
Yeah, like when you go through like in history class and we learn about some of these huge figures in history, they're awful people.
Mm-hmm.
And yet we're supposed to believe, oh, the universe was great back then, though. I have never once looked up into a textbook and looked at one of these people who've done awful things in the past and gone, so the world was great back then. Because I'm like, no, that person was still around and we're always going to have bad people around. Yeah, when it comes to holding accountability over art, we have more of a say in this day and age because our opinions can be heard through things like social media.
Mm-hmm.
We're not going to be completely silenced because someone's going to be able to go back in time and find tweets from 2007 and go, oh, like, and the complete future, they can be like, oh shit, this is what literally one person said.
Yeah.
Do you think it must be easy? Like, do you think Twitter will ever become like a valid point of reference for people, or are they just going to be like, no, this is
100%.
trash?
No, I think of I talk about this about like Gogglebox all the time, and I think especially with all this coronavirus, how it's been handled, or rather not handled by the British government in certain cases. I think that in the future coming, that's a genuine source of how the British public actually thought and felt about it. And that was like, one thing about the internet is meant that like we have a lot more credible sources for people studying this period in time and future, because there are a lot of opinions and they're sort of, I'm just thinking about setting like higher history, you know, when you had like a source and you had to like talk about like the time, the author, this, that and the other. I'm like, there's going to be so many more options available to people.
Yeah.
And I think we'll have a much more...
You could probably guess a date.
...detailed and accurate account of history. Like, there will be such an accurate account of history compared to, you know, what we know of the Vikings. Because we're able to communicate constantly now.
They weren't on social media?
Yeah, unfortunately not. You know, I would... love to have seen some of
that. Oh my god, like the original Thor having an Instagram. Do you think that in the Viking age there would have been like Insta baddies from the Viking era?
What, there are people really like particularly good. To be fair, people with like the big ships, like that was the Tesla of the day.
Oh my god, there's so many like okay, I'm gonna just put this out there. I'd love to do a podcast where we talk about like social media and how it would have been if it existed in a different time period.
Placing social media at different points in history.
That would be so fucking funny to me.
Oh, let's do it.
So the second argument that we have is from the author Maria Garcia. So she comes from a completely different standpoint from Ed Siegel, who is, I think it is worth mentioning, Ed is just a white cisgendered male. Maria is a cisgendered POC woman. Love that for her. So ultimately, she's a woman of color, not a POC woman. Anyway, so she talks about the fact that she immigrated to America and nothing felt more American to her than when she was dancing to Michael Jackson, because at the time Michael Jackson was the most popular artist basically alive.
Yeah, the thing is, she wasn't like particularly old, I don't think, either. Like,
no, she was very young when she came to the country.
Yeah.
She was saying that in her experience, to be a fan of Michael Jackson at this time period felt like a marker of her assimilation to the country. So as she was coming in, the only thing that really was able to make her feel like she was part of America was listening to Michael Jackson's music and feeling that same excitement that your average like Caucasian American walking down the street was feeling, not having immigrated. Yeah. I think it's such a shame when you listen to this story, because she talks about how her and her husband had both been huge fans of Michael Jackson. And then when the documentary for Leaving Neverland came out, or was it Finding Neverland? I think
it's Finding Neverland.
Oops. My bad.
Whoops.
So when that came out, it created quite a dilemma for her in the sense that she'd been like dancing to Michael Jackson with her son. Like she wanted to keep enjoying this music for as long as she was kicking it, you know? But when that documentary came out and so many people came forward with their opinions and their experiences with Michael, it created this really awkward position for her to have to start
Yeah.
debating whether she was going to keep art as part of the artist or separate the art to just enjoy it on its own. And she ultimately, like, in her argument, has made the decision that she doesn't wish to partake in listening to Michael Jackson any further.
And that was something that really struck with me, was that her main, argument throughout this was like, this hits home. This is like
Yeah,
the accusations and like everything that went on with Michael Jackson, especially in that documentary,
of
was to
course.
do with little boys. And she
Yeah,
has a young son. And I think that was
young
like
child.
perhaps why her argument is so strongly felt, because it's like, this is
Yeah.
something that I must protect. I must like,
hmm
and she makes some very, valid points throughout this.
She does. There's a lot more than just that topic about Michael. There's some real valid points that she brings forward.
What my personal favorite was the whole moment where she's talking about how little he actually suffered, like financially, as a
Yeah,
result of what happened.
yeah.
Are we, by continuing to pay money into, and even that streaming music, that's like, okay,
hmm
artists don't actually get a lot for streaming music. I think
Yeah.
it's like 0.1 penny per stream.
Yeah.
When you're someone like Michael Jackson, that makes
Adds up.
some squids for you.
It does make a couple.
It is quite difficult to see that. I think she uses the term brutalizing the most vulnerable, and
Yeah.
that was like, oh no.
It's hard, yeah. Like the point that she like that goes on with what you're making was that she said that art is part of the patriarchy, and so continuing
Yeah,
to support these male artists, you are just continuing on the patriarchy. Like you're supporting these men in power who are targeting vulnerable groups in society and benefiting from them in one way or another. And it's very true what she's saying. I find it difficult because whilst like overall at the end of her argument, I still don't 100% like I'm not after reading this, I didn't go, I'm never going to like partake in art that I think is possibly from someone questionable because I feel like there is a lot to look into before I can 100% be one way or the other. And there are some artists
yeah.
I'm like that with, to be fair.
The thing is, I don't have any personal boundaries on this that I have set. I
Yeah.
think it's very like, it's not like, oh, if a person has been accused of doing this, this is where my limit is. I think
Uh-huh.
which I don't know. It's not something I think we would ever agree on as a society. Like, oh, we will no longer
No.
do this because of XYZ. But agree with points that she's making here 100%. Like,
hmm
especially because it's something that has hit home with her. And I think that's like,
Yeah.
we're talking about, J.K. Rowling, and you're talking about Doja Cat, and that's like, these are
Yeah.
like case studies that are like applicable to us. Like the Michael Jackson thing is like, yeah, I think we're all sort of like aware of him, but he wasn't like of our generation, like
Yeah.
I guess the
Different
same
time,
level of like
different
icon.
place.
Um,
Yeah.
but we're obviously like aware of who he was and
Of
know him,
course.
sing the tunes, but I think I very much, even I can see pros and cons in both of the arguments that were made,
Totally.
with the whole giving them money still
hmm
doesn't sit right.
Yeah, I found for me the quote that I took down because I thought it was quite impactful was that she said that ultimately I choose to honor the truths that have been silenced. And I think that that is a very hard stance to have to take because you are ultimately siding with people who like she's saying they've been silenced. It's hard to get the truth out once someone has already been silenced. So I think that her standing by this and supporting like the people of color, the women, the victims, and those that have been just used and abused by the industry, I think that that's where I agree with her the most.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, yes, I do want to support you in this because no one should be silenced for being in a vulnerable group. if anything, they should be projected. And that's why I think, especially in these days, if there's a group of people who are less privileged than you are, it's like a social responsibility to be amplifying their voices and to try and like let people hear what they're saying. I mean, when we go on to, we're just about to move on to J.K. Rowling and transphobia, we gathered insight through an actual, like a trans male, a YouTuber named Jammidodger is the person that we went to because they made a couple of videos about this and we wanted to discuss it. But obviously, neither one of us are equipped to speak on behalf of trans people. So I think it just made more sense for us to go through it that way. But overall, I would say that for that argument there, I do agree that you just have to try and support the victims that have been silenced.
Yeah. Very well put.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much. So moving on to J.K. Rowling, I think we should just first point out the fact that I liked from an overall perspective. J.K. Rowling is very vocal about a lot of different groups, and she completely shows hypocrisy in her own storytelling by the whole plot point of her writing a bit like a mudblood was to show that there are people out there who are looked at as being lesser because they're not the exact same as someone else.
Yeah, for something they're born with and cannot help.
Yeah, something that is... I mean, there's another quote from, like, she wrote from Dumbledore's perspective that's saying, like, it doesn't matter, like, what body you're born into, it's what you do with, like, your time. So, for her to make these comments within her own storytelling, but then get on Twitter, you know, hop on there and decide that she's gonna shit on the entire, like, trans community, it does create, like, a lot of controversy.
She basically bases her whole argument around the fact that, and she doesn't really talk about trans men, she talks mainly about trans women and accuses them of being predatory. She, you know, has shared that she is a survivor of domestic abuse, sexual assault and stuff.
Yes. Of course,
which is horrific and no one should ever have to go through that. But she has, I don't know if she's explicitly said herself, but has agreed with and responded with people that believe that allowing trans women into women's bathrooms and changing rooms, etc., is a hazard.
I think that she really goes into the topic, like the tweet that's been discussed and questioned by Jammidodger, at least one of them, goes over the fact that she has a problem with another article that goes into discussion about people who menstruate. She decides that she's going to take like this like sarcastic, like she just wants to be a bit of an ass with this one by saying, like, she's like, I think there's a word for those people who menstruate. What do we call them again? And she starts giving like different spellings of the word woman. But in doing so, as it's pointed out, she's excluding others who are women who just don't menstruate. I know that there are a lot of people
there are cisgender women who for various reasons won't menstruate. Like, cisgendered women over a certain age go through menopause and don't menstruate anymore. Just do they then stop?
Yeah. So they just
stop
give it
being
up.
A woman?
Yeah. It's and also it is people who menstruate, because those who are in the process of transitioning will probably still be dealing with menstruation. It's not something that just goes away because they start treatment, you know?
Yeah, and also, you know, not everyone can afford like treatments.
Surgery. Not everyone can get that.
You know, there are I would believe that there are plenty of trans men that will continue to menstruate for the rest of their lives, but that doesn't mean that they're not men, and that is because sex and gender are not equivalent.
The same.
Like, they're not the same thing.
They're not the same thing at all.
I think the big thing is that, you know, people seem to be working on the basis that they are. And as a general overview, it's put very well on Jammidodger's video with the one with his girlfriend. They go into like TERFs, they go into all the articles in like detail and really, you know, succinctly put many, many valid points. But sex is something that you're assigned at birth. Like, it is a binary thing. Sex is sex. However, gender is not.
Gender is a social construct.
it's a social construct and it's a spectrum, and
Mm-hmm.
also not something that people have control of.
Totally. You don't have any control over it. And I wish that someone could, pass the message to JK, who like loved to speak about this in her writing, and how you have no control over your destiny. But she just I don't get it. I want to say that she's smart enough to understand it, but I also can't tell if it's just that she's so set in her ways that there's no way of changing her mind.
Yeah, I think it's just so difficult to believe that someone who would write these really empowering stories that are loved by, all types of people.
She inspired
Like,
so
it's
many.
not. And, the people who are discriminatory in those books are the people that come off worse in the end. The good guys
They're her villains.
win. And it's
Yeah.
rough.
It is pretty rough.
She has a lot of clearly, like, I think old-fashioned biases. They don't really have a place. That all this, like, retroactively, saying that she included gay characters, like,
Cool. You did the bare minimum. Let's maybe up the game a bit. It does create like a is that really what you planned to do, or did you just think this is the time that you can benefit from creating a statement about it?
Was this like a publicist that said to you, like,
Yeah, has someone in your team come up to you and said, "Hey, do you know what will get some more sales? Just say this person's gay on Twitter, because that's gonna do something." I found it incredibly like uplifting to see that. So like the people that realistically were selected to represent her creation as it came into film, like the two main actors, you've got Daniel Radcliffe and you've got Eddie Redmayne, who's also for the Fantastic Beasts sides of things. Both of them very vocally have disagreed with her opinions. Not only that, but majority of the casts involved have disagreed with her opinions. You of course have some larger names who just never really get involved in these discussions. So, I mean, like you have like Johnny Depp. Like I don't think Johnny Depp's going to be coming out anytime soon.
well, he was sort of mid-court case during all of this. So I would believe that he was probably strongly advised not to say.
Of course not. I find it great to see that there are people who are out there that have, come into the universe that she's created and has benefited from. And, they benefited from
100%.
themselves. So it's nice to see them take a stance that's, we understand that we have benefited from being in these films. We know how much they mean to people. And to think that we're excluding any trans people who are happy in the world of Harry Potter or in the world of Fantastic Beasts, I think that really speaks to them and their characters, and it's why it creates much of like a much harsher situation with JK, where you don't want to give her benefit of the doubt. You don't want to let her like get away with this, because the people that are alongside her for the journey, the ones that have ultimately come on to her creation, they're speaking up.
Well, that's when you look at someone like Eddie Redmayne, like he's had his own journey with this issue.
Yeah, of course.
He did that film where he played a trans woman.
The Danish woman, I think, yeah.
That was quite a controversial casting.
It was. It does create like a bigger question of trans people in media,
Yeah, and I think, so through backlash and this, that, and the other that I'm assuming he went through during that, I'm assuming has then educated himself more.
To feel informed enough to make a statement.
That was like a nice little positive journey, I think,
Mm-hmm.
to have hit the media.
I agree with you. I'd say that one of the things that I've written down was that I couldn't believe that, during a time where the world is so divisive because of a pandemic, that she still finds it appropriate and like her place to spend all of her time, or spend a large chunk of her time, creating more problems for people with her larger platform. Like, I think that the reason why we were so quick to want to cancel people in culture is that we understand that these people have large platforms, so they will influence opinions through the grapevine. Like, as it goes down, people will see this on their timelines, they'll start to see bits of it, and someone might read it and be like, yeah, I agree, without fully seeing all the different sides to the argument. So when you are like someone with such a
Mm-hmm.
platform like JK, I get why it is that people want to try and, silence her platform in some ways. It comes into the whole case of censorship. Like, I mean, recently, not to kind of go off topic, but I'm going to go off topic. So, when Donald
Mm.
Trump's been tweeting recently about election results and how the votes are coming in through the mail-in
Oh
system,
gosh.
Twitter is quite
Yeah.
literally giving disclaimers to say, don't listen to this fully. He's not 100% accurate. And this is maybe the first time in my life that I've ever seen Twitter providing some form of censorship over anyone. I, I feel like at most I'll
Yeah.
ever see is someone's account's been suspended. But to see literal flags that are coming up and saying, hey, no, he's talking shit, don't listen to him. It's
Yeah. It's
interesting. And
like
I
it's
wonder
100%. It's not over till it's over. Yeah.
hmm and I wonder, is this going to be something that becomes part of how we use the internet, part of how Twitter is used, that you're able to have Twitter officials come on and be like, no, this doesn't stand by guidelines, this is wrong, or this is too hateful. Like, oh, at what point, you know?
Yeah. I mean, that's a whole can of worms. Stuff. Some things that I've looked at and come across regarding
hmm
J.K. Rowling is
Yes.
people now trying reclaiming the Harry Potter series and doing the whole,
hmm
oh, I can't believe insert name here wrote the Harry Potter series. I
hmm
can't believe X, or like
Yes.
making it like authorless. And I think that's sort of problematic in itself. Like I love that. I love
hmm
the energy behind it,
Totally.
and I think it's a lovely sentiment. But I
Uh-huh.
think, as I said earlier in the podcast,
hmm
context is so important to everything.
Totally.
Like, there's a reason they make you do that at Nat 5 History, at like,
Yeah.
J.K. Rowling has biases that live within those books, that
Yeah, she does.
conscious and unconscious, hateful and not
hmm
hateful, that's what makes the books. And there's like, there are things that like I have come across that are, I was like, I didn't pick up on that at all
hmm
in reading these books until it was pointed out to me. I think to say that it's authorless is to like, I don't know, it detaching it from her completely is not completely beneficial,
hmm
because it wouldn't have it just wouldn't be what it was, without
Yeah,
her
I think I completely agree with you.
being part
You're
of it.
saying the point that her inclusion and her work in and of itself is part of who she is. So if there were any little factors about that we changed in who she is as a person, it wouldn't have created the same way, and it wouldn't have been presented the same way.
Hmm.
I agree. I do think it's a tricky subject because hmm
But I do 100% also, on the other hand,
hmm
you know, I think we can enjoy the world that she's created, and we
yeah
can read the book. I'm not saying that we shouldn't engage in the material. I'm just saying
hmm
be
look
aware
at the
of
material.
the larger context of what you're dealing with. And that's
Yeah,
difficult to say with a kid's book. But we as
100%.
adults,
hmm
can look at it and be like, I know a bit more about the world going into this.
Yeah,
I can
I've
see,
gathered
you
some
can, as long
information.
as you can acknowledge. Yeah, I think my overall takeaway from that whole thing was like, it's not, don't engage with the material at all, because that begins a whole censorship thing. And like,
Yeah,
boycotting can be useful for many, many things,
yes,
has
it's
been
been shown.
historically. I just don't know if this is necessarily.
Mm. I feel like from my standpoint, I put myself in the position where if I can see this directly like profiting J.K. Rowling, who continues to like keep these profits and benefit from them and sit on top of her like ivory tower where she can just say hateful things, that's where I stop myself. I'm like, I'm not gonna buy this because I think this will benefit you. However, I still have a lot of
Mm,
feelings toward the films because realistically, she had very little going on with the film. She was the story. a film in and of itself becomes a different thing when you have people involved, and I'm sure she had a lot of says in it, but ultimately it becomes something different there, and I don't want to benefit her directly, so I try my best not to put money in that woman's pocket.
I get that. That is a fair point. I can't say it's necessarily what I have done.
This is the thing, is it's all different. Like, we all have different experiences and we all have different approaches, so there's no wrong or right way to do it. We're just doing what we think is best for us.
Yeah, and then there's also, as we said at the start of the podcast, there's not going to be a right answer here.
No.
Other than, you know,
it's just a discussion.
Don't vocally support hateful people, don't actively support hateful people, educate yourself, be conscious of what you're engaging with, what you're consuming.
Yeah.
Try your best to understand the biases of... It's the same as like when you buy a newspaper.
Yeah.
You know? They're very political readings.
Extremely.
And I would say be as aware of all the media that you consume as you can be.
I come from very much the standpoint as well that even if you have made like a decision, or you've like watched something or supported something for a long time, and then you discover that it's not actually something worth supporting, or it's something that is questionable, there's nothing stopping you from holding yourself accountable and saying, yeah, I did watch this and I did like it, but I don't agree with it anymore. Because change is important. And
you're allowed to make progress.
Oh, totally. For many situations, I think there's a lot of, I did this, I don't agree with it, I'm going to move on now with a different approach. And that, to me, is what I look for in people that maybe state things that I don't 100% agree with.
And that's all we can hope for as well. Like, and that's going back to what we said at the very start, you know, we can hope for change within people that are still living. And I think that's what makes it harder, I guess, with the whole boycotting or censorship. But as long as we're doing what we can within ourselves and within our immediate communities and just being a bit more aware socially, you're always going to make boo-boos. Everyone will. You're if you are the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room. Completely
getting it. Oh. Overall, though, I'd say that the takeaway from this, like you just said there, is a lot of, it's just be a good person. Like, it's not hard. Try and be your best person, even if you don't want to be. Just push for that, because ultimately, especially when you're creating art, like, if your intent is good, that's something you can stand strong in, and you can hold that over your head at the end of the day and say, I didn't create this because I wanted to hurt anyone. I created this because it's something that makes me feel happy. And I think that's the important part about art, is that we're all getting something good out of it.
Yeah, we're all just trying to be the best version of ourselves. Let's go with that. The best version of you. And that can be upgraded every day.
It can be,
you know,
very easily.
You can upgrade yourself more often than Apple. And it won't slow down your system.
And it won't, I mean, it will probably drain you of your battery life, but you can always recharge. That's
you just
the beauty
go have
of
a
life.
little snooze. Have a little, yeah.
So I think that we've gone over mostly what we wanted to discuss today, so I think it's probably time that we wrap this up. Oh.
We put a little ribbon round it for the day.
Thank you guys so much for listening, if you are listening. All we've done today is to share a couple of our thoughts here. Feel free to make your own. Feel free to agree or disagree, because why not? And remember that it's not always dark at 6 o'clock. Thank you.